welcome everyone to one of today's collaboration sessions, Destigmatizing Remote Data Collection, which will be hosted by our colleague from the World Food Program, Rossella Bottone. So out of the necessity, much of the data that was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic was done remotely. And unfortunately, there is still somewhat of a stigma around the limitations to this data collection technique, while many of the benefits might be ignored. This collaborative session, so we will be doing breakout rooms today, will focus on destigmatizing remote data collection and the quality of the data, exploring some of the experience gained and honed by implementing partners, and the benefits, limitations, or biases implicit in remote data collection, some of the challenges and opportunities that can arise from that. So I will now introduce my colleague who's so graciously put this whole session together, Rossella Bottone. She is a vulnerability analyst advisor for the United Nations World Food Program. She is currently based in Panama and has more than 15 years experience in the humanitarian sector, and she is an expert in emergency food security assessments, vulnerability surveys, and data analysis in support of early warning and emergency preparedness. She's worked in Nepal, Guatemala, Haiti, Senegal, the DRC, Italy, and has conducted needs assessments for World Food Program in more than 20 countries in Latin America and Africa. She holds a master's degree in international cooperation from the University of Pavia and is currently pursuing a master in humanitarian action from SOAS in the University of London. Originally from Italy, Rossella is married and has 4 children. She's passionate about her job, traveling and cooking. She thinks that food as love brings people together, and she strives for a world where the right to food is guaranteed even in times of crisis. So I will hand it over to Rossella for a brief presentation before we'll move on to our breakout rooms. So Rossella.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks everybody for joining. And I'm happy to be here and participating in this conference. And I'm happy also to discuss with you in this collaborative session as we reason around the use of food security remote data collection for food security analysis. What I wanted to start with is something that it may be very intuitive, but something that some challenge that I faced, in particular last year with remote data collection. At present, every day real-time information is already part of our daily life. I mean, think of every day when you go to the office, or when you used to go to the office. You use, for example, a navigator. I mean, before we would open a map, or we would use, some instruments to help us navigate around the city. But now every morning, even this morning, I wake up and I use the Waze, and Waze is based on live and real-time data where other drivers are telling me which streets are more crowded and where is the police, or if there is an accident on the road. And somehow we trust this information. This is just one example, but of course there are several examples on how we generally trust remote and real-time data for functioning in our everyday life. It's also true that, next slide please, it's also true that at present there is more an increase of using real-time data in the humanitarian development sector, and in the maps that you will see, there are some examples, some very famous examples that were developed during the pandemic. Maybe in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was checking the maps around the world, seeing the cases and the deaths, etc. And again, we were trusting this information. We were looking at how the pandemic was evolving, and we were all reasoning about this data that was somehow coming from remote and real-time data collection. But what happens when it comes to food security? Next slide. It's overwhelmingly, we still use static data and periodic data. I just put up a couple of maps that we generally use for food security analysis based on our assessment. For example, in WFP, we mostly, the food security communities, we mostly use IPC maps that are based on periodic analysis or static data. So we get together, we analyze the data that we have, and we produce a map. And based on this map, we organize our programs, we plan our intervention. And this works. There's nothing wrong with that. And these are highly, technical products that we have been using. I've been with WFP for almost 20 years, that we have been using maps and to represent our vulnerability analysis, to target, to prioritize, and the IPC has also been there for quite a long time. So there's nothing wrong with these products, and this is not what we would like to discuss, but I would like to point out how in different contexts, in different historical moments, I mean, we could also learn from what we use in our daily life. If we trust real-time data to go to the office, if we trust real-time data to monitor our steps, if we trust real-time data from many of the information that we gather every day, why we don't trust real-time data so much for humanitarian work? And next slide, please. So last year, when the pandemic hit, at WFP, we were at the crossroads because WFP is an agency that generally collects a lot of face-to-face data. We still collect regularly household level food security surveys or emergency food security assessment, and we have made a pride in the fact that we go on the field and we actually collect data all the time. So when the pandemic hit last year, we were at the crossroads, and because we could not reach people, we couldn't go out there and interview people. We couldn't put both our enumerator at risk, but most importantly, we couldn't put people at risk because going household to household would expose people to a risk. So we had already been using for quite some time remote data collection, but we had to enhance it. Can we have a next slide, please? And that is why we started to look into near real-time monitoring for food security. We've been using a variety of tools. More traditionally, WFP had already been looking with phone calls, but the innovation that we introduced massively during the COVID pandemic was collecting data through the web. We have partnered with the company. It's called Riwi, and I have Mercedes with us in the session. I hope she will be able to contribute during the breakout rooms. So Riwi has helped us collect remote data collection through the web with the technology that calls randomize, basically randomize the data that are collected. And this has allowed us to have real-time data. So basically we have launched surveys in all the countries of presence in Latin America, and we have collected data that have helped us have a timely diagnosis of the situation. And this has helped us to understand what was going on, because having all this data coming in allowed us to monitor change, to understand what was the impact of the pandemic, and to have something to say, to have a contribution to say, because we could be more effective in understanding the situation, in advocating with donors, in discussing with governments to point out which were the needs that were arising. And we were also being able to hear from the people. One things that we have learned in this periodic round of data collection is that we could use both standard food security and vulnerability indicators, and then also we could use qualitative data analysis. What we have experimented in the various rounds of data collection that we have used is that, again, we have tried various standard indicators that are generally used for food security analysis. For example, the food consumption score, the household hunger score, the COVID strategy index, and we have started to build a knowledge. We have started to understand which indicator works better, which other indicators work less better because maybe they are too long. We have tried to understand from people based on the patterns, the way they respond, how the question should be formulated to capture people's attention. And also we have tried to use more of qualitative data, so the possibility for people to freely write about what was happening, for example. And this is something that gave us an insight of what was happening, because we all know that when people are alone in front of a screen, maybe they feel free to speak what is on their mind and to add something that could help us better understand a situation. The other good thing is that we could collect a huge amount of data. In every round, one of the last rounds that we conducted in Argentina, for example, we had in a very short time around 14,000 surveys collected. And this has been the pattern in many countries. And it's true that the data collected remotely are sometimes shorter questionnaires because people get tired. We could not collect the standard 200 variables questions that we collect when we visit households, but even over a shorter questionnaire, having 14,000 data representative at department level, you know, at the lower administrative level, means that we have a huge amount of data and that we have a lot of information that can be explored for understanding what is going on, where are the problems, who are the people that are suffering the most. I want just to mention that we have tried to explore several modalities. As I mentioned, we have partnered massively with Riwi, but they've also explored using collecting data over social networks, including Instagram or Facebook or other, you know, modalities. But we have found as WSP that when we anonymously collect data, we have better results, because in many countries, when the data is manifestly collected from WSP online, we have seen that we have slightly more negative response, maybe because WSP is identified as a you know, an assistance provider. So one thing that I can say already that we have learned is that when data is anonymously collected, saying just that, you know, we are conducting an assessment to collect data and to gain better understanding of the situation in a given country, we had better results. What happened? What were the problems? Some of the problems that we encountered that then I would like to discuss with you. So next slide. Why I was doing my introduction on the fact that we rely on real-time data collection, because we have faced a lot of resistance from managers, from government counterparts when we started to use remote data. Whenever I have introduced web data collection with the government or even with WSP managers, country directors, the first, I mean, in general, I have to say on average, the first reaction has been suspicious. People were telling me, can we trust this data? Are we stealing data from people? All these weird questions, as if we are the only one collecting data remotely, and as if this was something that we should not be doing, because this is not something that we knew we are confident about. There was a lot of resistance also over quality. One of the main objections that I've had repeatedly is that not everybody uses internet. So there is an inherent bias in remote data collection, which is true. And the other objections was maybe the people with data mostly need do not have internet, so which is maybe also true. But as let's say as people with technical skills and that use, you know, these kind of tools, we try to object with this resistance and with this observation by using information, by using data. So we have widely explored also together with our partners. We have tested data collection before implementing every round. We have looked at those intern coverage. We have tried to understand the biases. Who were the people that would be eventually excluded? Were the people living in rural areas, were certain age groups, etc. So to understand what would be the potential bias in the collection of data. And also we have wanted to, some things that, you know, I want to say, that's why we call the session this demystifying, that we wanted to demystify. I mean, people use internet and use social network all the time, even when they are in the most vulnerable situation. Indeed, we have had an overwhelming response in web survey by, for example, Venezuelan migrants. And there were a lot of resistance in the beginning of using this tool for collecting data with Venezuelan migrants, because everybody assumed that people do not have access to the internet, that do not have access to social networks, and that they would not respond. But instead, we have showed how people turn to social networks in a moment of difficulty at present as a place where maybe they can find information, they can find other people that are in the same situation. Think of all these Facebook groups that pop up. And when navigating in these, for example, in these social networks, they can also are generally also willing to share information about their condition. So one of the first things that we have learned is that actually a lot of people, when they are in need, they turn to the social network. And I want just give you one other example. We had piloted the one remote data collection during the Bahama emergency in September 2019 during the hurricane. And again, I mean, at that time, we had an idea with the regional team to launch a real-time data collection using a tool. It's called Survey 123. that is shared through social networks. So we used to share it on, Facebook and Instagram pages of the civil protection in the Bahamas. Surprisingly enough, during the hurricane, while people were under the rain, they would go to the page, the social network of the civil protection, to report where they were, to report that they were safe or not, as a lot of people do, and they were answering the surveys. And I have to say the immediate reaction we had, the people got scared, managers got scared, because they said, oh, what are we going to do with all these data people answering when they are under the hurricane and indicating where they are and what kind of help we need? And I had already understood at this time that we have to work on this resistance. We have to work on the fact that sometimes we have all this wealth of information, and the first reaction was, what are we going to do? We don't know, because we have never had real-time data during an hurricane action. Then something else that has posed a challenge, and I will stop here, is that when we build real-time data collection, for example, we embedded in a dashboard, and the data come in and immediately they are visualized and transformed into an indicator. Sometimes we don't like what comes out. And it's not like an assessment where you see it, you look at the results, and then you post it. It's real time. And sometimes it has happened that we see a trend that we would not expect, or we're working with the government and they are surprised because the data are worse or better than expected. And so it poses an additional challenge, because this is happening real time, and sometimes it has put us in a situation where we have to deal with issues. What do we do when the data do not come out as we would expect it? So I have some more examples to share with you, but I would like to stop here, because what we would like to do, and I'll hand over to Chris that will explain what we'll do in the first breakout room to discuss together these challenges.
So the first question, what are some other, Rossella outlined quite a few challenges in the remote data collection space. What are other challenges that you see in remote data collection? Okay, Nestor. Nestor was in another session that I had yesterday, so I appreciate more collaboration from Nestor. Nestor said poor internet connectivity and phone services. Would you like to expand on that at all, Nestor?
Yes, when we try to do that, we have some places in remote areas like in Syria, in Yemen, where internet connection is almost nothing. And people didn't have even mobile phones. And in the places where there are phone services, it was so weak that in the middle of the interview, that's dropping off. So we have to try it again and again. So that is a big challenge, because that extends the timing on the interview also.
Yes, I think this is one, thank you, Nestor. I think this is one challenge that we have when we conduct what we call the computer-assisted telephone interviews, over the phone, where connectivity is an issue. And it's true that we have to conduct an assessment of what are the infrastructures and, the access in the areas. For some remote areas, when instead of using phone calls, which can be long and extended and require a longer line, we have tried to switch to, that's why we have tried to switch to web survey, where and the link has been shared. Can be random, like the one we have done with Iwi, can be shared over a communication. In Latin America, we use a lot WhatsApp, and we shared over WhatsApp network. And one thing that we've done in some area is that we have looked at installing Wi-Fi access, so that people that would, in public places. So this would create hotspots that would allow people to have an internet connection and would allow them to have internet access. Sometimes it would be that it was a landing page, so people would have free internet, but on the landing page, before accessing the Wi-Fi, they had to answer a few questions. So this is true, and we have to be aware of the context and the situation, but we need to be also creative and find a turnaround to allow people access to sharing info. I can see that Tarif has raised his hand.
Thank you. So, first of all, thanks for the wonderful presentation that you made. As we know, the WFP is probably pioneer in setting up those phone-based, food security data collection for its MVAM. Some of the challenges that we see is there was a study recently done, not recently, in 2020 done, which shows that in Malawi and Uganda, which shows that the access to phone is strongly correlated with socioeconomic status of households. So while we are trying, both WFP and most of the other organizations, we are trying to reach out and support most vulnerable people who are not, probably their socioeconomic status is not, or rather I would say that they are more poorer segment of the community, right? So access to phone, and then that same study also found that among the people who have access to phone, the response rate is also strongly correlated with socioeconomic status of the household. So my question is how WFP, based on your experience, how you are addressing this particular problem, while of course having access to data is hugely beneficial compared to having no access, but how WFP is accessing or addressing this particular problem. So that's one question. The second question is when you are analyzing the data, how you are addressing biases and representativeness of your target population. Over.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Arif. Very interesting questions. I will try to address them to the best of my knowledge. Regarding phone surveys, I want to make a difference. So at present, we are using a wealth of modality, for remote data collection. One is phone survey, which is historically been used for longer in WFP, what we have called the MVAM, and that we widely use at present for real-time food security monitoring. We have created a younger map live that is mostly based on phone calls. The advantage of phone calls is on the one side that there is a human interaction. So with the phone calls, we are actually, there is a trained enumerator that is calling people. And the fact that there is a human interaction allows for providing clarification, probing when asking a question, and also collecting certain data that is more difficult to collect without assistance, because the enumerator can explain to the person. And so we have used widely, when we are currently used in many countries, phone survey, what we call the CASI, generally computer assisted telephone interview, because of the fact that we have tested also that we have already tested, we conduct studies comparing phone data collection with physical data collection. And we have seen the standard food security indicator, like the food consumption score, for example, yields very similar, if not identical results. What is the issue in countries like the one that you mentioned, like Malawi or Uganda? We have had a similar issue in some countries in Central America and Honduras, where we have also information that phone ownership is linked to a certain socioeconomic status, and that maybe the coverage is not so wide as we would expect. So first of all, we analyze the situation in these countries. It's true that we can have, we analyze basically the bias, and we can go different roads. One road is that in some countries, we can still collect the data and look at it as the upper, let's say, level of the situation, understanding for what it is and for what we know, and considering that there are people that are excluded. One other option that we have is that instead of collecting data as household level data, we use more informed and higher level people as key informants. So instead of asking about their individual, if this is again phone interview, instead of asking them about their individual situation, we ask them as a broader situation of people in their community, people in their neighborhood, the people in the area where they live. So instead of having, and this is what we generally do when we do key informant interview or let's say qualitative data collection. So instead of analyzing the data as only related to that particular household, we ask many people that are answering about a broader situation. So we can still get an information, but not only about themselves, but enlarging a bit the scope, trying to cover in the people that are not themselves able to answer. We have offered in some countries incentive. It's true what you said, that it's true that phone access is maybe linked to socioeconomic, but mostly because in some countries people can have a phone, but they cannot charge it. For example, they cannot put credit on it to use it. So in some countries where, like in Haiti, what we have done is that we are using an incentive for phone data collection. So people receive a small recharge on their phone, and they are then, let's say, encouraged to answer to these surveys because they get a small $1, $2, I don't know, that would allow us to have some airtime on the phone, and would allow the possibility to include people that otherwise would not respond. Because in some countries, the companies do not allow not even to receive the call if you don't have airtime on the phone. And then the last thing, again, as I said, is to switch to other modalities. That's why we have moved beyond the phone data collection, because, okay, people can say if you don't have a phone, you don't have a social network. But surprisingly enough, we are discovering that people would share phones to connect with a social network. And I don't know, use the Facebook, use Instagram. And what we would need to provide was instead an internet connection. We have also in the past, a couple of years ago, we had partnered with Facebook with their reporting. When Facebook asks these questions on reporting when you're okay, I don't know, after an hurricane or after a shock, and we were trying to explore, what is the pattern of people, and we have seen that there is an overwhelming response in this type of events, even from people that are from lower economic background. So I think the short answer to your question is that, first of all, we need to understand the context very well. We need to study the context very well, and we need to find solutions that are different based on the context. Like we have done, for example, in Haiti, where we have provided incentives, or in Colombia, where we have created Wi-Fi hotspots so that people could connect. How do we address the bias? That's a good question. I would like to give an example with the latest assessment we conducted with DIWI in Argentina. Argentina is a non-present country, and in any case, we have been requested by the Ministry of Social Development to collect a survey to look at the performance of their food card. We have collected a lot of data. As I said, valid. We had over 200 people that corresponded, and Mercedes, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but 200,000 people, but only 14,000 were completed. So first lesson, and this is, we are learning as we do it. We have understood that there are a lot of people that drop out. So what we are doing now is that we would like to do an analysis to understand what are the people that drop out. Are they because they're less educated, they are younger, they are older? We don't know. We are looking at that to understand better and to learn from the future. But one thing we know for sure is that we had 14,000 valid surveys. And as I said, the first reaction we had locally was that, is this data good enough? Is this data representative enough? Is this data not biased? So what we did is that, what we do when we have remote data is that we look at data that exists in the country. For example, for Argentina, we looked at the national surveys that have been conducted. We look at the census, we look at national DHS data. We look at a solid representative data collection that had already been realized in the survey. And we analyze the variables in terms of age, gender, education level, population density. So we look at a report, that has been, or the data set has been constructed based on face-to-face, broad, widely representative data. And then we look at our survey and we found out the difference. So maybe I would be happy, if there are follow-up questions, to share some of the results with Argentina. We look at demographic, what are the people that answer, where were the difference? And for example, we noticed that there is slightly younger people that respond to a web survey versus the standard population. So we look at the demographic pyramids, and we look at the population density, for example, was equal. So basically, it seems like we had cut and paste. So because we had the same amount of people in proportion that responded to face-to-face survey to the remote web survey, then we look at other variable, education level. One of the things that people raise in Argentina, what if only educated people responded? So we look at, okay, what is in your stats in the census is the education level in Argentina. How is spread across the population? There are people less educated, there are people middle and lower educated. And we compared with the result of our surveys. And that's how we, if necessary, it was not the case for Argentina because Argentina has very wide internet coverage. So we had a very good result. But for some countries, sometimes we have to introduce weight in the analysis. In case there is a bias in the gender that is represented or in the age that is represented, we try to introduce analytical weight to balance the answers of certain groups over the others. And of course, we look at socioeconomic analysis because it's very important. So we try to understand, compared to existing data, compared to existing survey, if the people that answered are only from the richer group or are representative of all the socioeconomic groups using some of the questions that we have in the survey. So we try to balance that, and we try to compare it to existing data to account for the existing bias. One last thing that I want to mention is that now that the situation is improving and that things are changing, we are also conducting. We've just done one round. I mean, we're Central America, we will repeat it. We are conducting at the same time face-to-face data with remote data, with phone and with web. And we will want to explore what are the difference in food security outcome to understand to what extent we can confirm that remote data is good enough to collect standard food security indicators. But I think, it's still a learning process, but definitely there is a wealth there. And even if sometimes there are biases and there are limitations, if we are aware of these limitations, we can account for them. There is still a lot of data that we can use and that can be very useful for targeting and for planning intervention.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rossella. That was very informative. We have lots of other good questions and comments in the chat. I'd like to move to our next kind of big bucket question about, and we got to a little bit with some of the things Rossella was talking about, but how you would tackle some of these challenges. So I noticed a comment from Stacy Prito about existing, and I think Rossella talked about this a little bit, and there's been similar comments, but existing data collection tools being quite long and difficult to adapt to the phone or remote settings. So maybe if Stacy, if she or he has some ideas about how you could tackle this challenge. Otherwise, we can open it to the floor. But I'd like to start by thinking through how you would tackle these challenges of trying to take some of these long surveys and shorten them so that they're manageable for the phone setting.
The only thing that I would say is that in some cases, we've looked at tools and said, are there some things that we can remove in such a way that we can get them down to a phone survey? But in some cases, that's just not simply possible. And so, we've just been kind of stuck. And so I was keen to know if others had found solutions perhaps that we hadn't thought of.
Thanks, Stacy. Olufemi Felipe also had a similar comment. They mentioned that reducing, shortening the questionnaire is probably the best, but I'm not sure if you overcome some of the loss of the data. So I'm not sure if they have any more comments around that specifically about tackling that particular issue.
Welcome if colleagues, of course, they would have had suggestions or share their experience. It's key. I've seen one of the comments in the chat. The length of the questionnaires is key. In particular, if it's for both cases, for phone, where you are assisted by an operator, or for web. For the web, we have seen that after a certain amount of questions, we are below 40 questions at present, because otherwise people drop out. They lose interest, they are distracted, and they do not contribute. And we are trying to understand also how we can improve that. You know, if there is some question, maybe we have to place before, so to raise the interest, and then so people continue to the end, etc. Instead to put, let's say, that's why some of the boring questions like what is your education level, I don't know, I put at the end so that we get the bulk of the answer. But I think we're still learning, and you know, necessarily if you have other suggestions, I mean, feel free to jump in. But I think yes, length is important. There is a lot of dropout. Indeed, as I said, I mean, in some countries, even in Ecuador, we had over 100,000 people starting the questionnaire, and 10% of these completed it. So we are still losing, but it's overwhelming so many. I mean, when we would be able to have 13,000 answers in face-to-face? I mean, we have recently conducted a survey in Central America. It costs a lot of money to collect 1,500 face-to-face surveys. Of course, they're more complete. Of course, they're more informative, but we cover, we get information from many people, and we hear from them with the qualitative data. So the wealth that we have, I think it's an opportunity for us. It's a very big opportunity that we have.
I think we wanted to also have a comment from one of a fellow food program person.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in about the questionnaire length, because I know that's something that we often run into as well. Working alongside Rossella, we often have to figure out how to optimize the questionnaires to best fit for respondents, to make sure that we're getting the data we need. And Stacey, you brought up something, or just as you said, if there's other tools or other things to consider. And one way that we like to think about it is using skip logic, or kind of a tree of sorts, so that each respondent is seeing a path that is customized for just themselves based on their previous answers to prior questions. So if we are doing a survey that is targeting both migrants and host communities, for example, in one country, being able to ask specific questions to migrants and specific questions to host communities. That's one way that we can reduce the overall number of questions, but also still get the data and the information that we need while not fatiguing respondents or asking too much from them. And I think that's also quite important when we think about the accessibility, the time constraints that respondents have, and overall just respect for their time and what they have the ability to do or complete at any one given time. So data quality, but also respondent best practice.
Thanks, Mercedes. I did want to go back to another, maybe we can continue with the tackling challenges, but Nestor had comments about changing phone numbers. So I wonder if he has any ideas for how you would tackle that particular challenge.
Hello. Chris.
Yeah, hi, Nestor.
The problem that we have, especially we had projects with Venezuelan immigrants in Latin America. So they are very mobile, and it's not only the telephone number, but the location where they live. They are always moving. And yeah, what we have done is just tried, and when they come for the distribution, update on a regular basis their phone number or the location, because otherwise the first experience that we have, that when they register at the beginning they give a phone number, and then when we want to do PDMs, the phone number was not working or has already been canceled. There is other person there. So and then sometimes they don't have telephone number, but they give us the telephone number of a friend of a relative. So when we call to do the interview, so they have to call them out. So that's a big challenge that we have, especially in Latin America with immigrant people. I don't know if anybody else has the same experience, but that's what we have.
Dalmar, go ahead. I'd love to hear your.
Yes, thank you, Rossella. I think this one question, very interesting question that Rossella raised that I needed just a follow up on. In the past, where we have used these food security indicators, consistently used, food consumption score, HHS, RCSI, in contexts such as South Sudan, where they know that the South Sudan, Somalia, a lot of these other emergency areas where they know that this information is being collected and maybe tied to assistance, we have found those consumption indicators are kind of like were being directed towards, maybe receiving assumptions, and therefore, for example, in the IPC community, we use those consumption scores and, many of these indicators a lot, and we found ourselves consistently, those numbers are higher, because they know that this is tied to assistance. So the question that one interesting thing that Rossella raised was saying that when data is collected without people knowing who it's collected for, then we get better information. Can you just explain a little bit further, Rossella, if you don't mind, because that's something that has been intriguing us within the IPC community. Over.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. So we have tried to collect data with different modalities, as I said, and we have, in Latin America, we have partnered with RIWI. I mean, Mercedes is here, she can explain a bit better the technology. When these surveys are sent over the web, you don't see, there is not an identity. I mean, there is not like, it's not coming from WFP, it's not coming from the government. It's a random pop-up questions. It appears on your screen. Would you like to participate in a survey to understand the situation in your country? So we have conducted also other surveys using social networks, for example, Facebook. The problem is that when we use Facebook, we have to share the data, the survey, through our WFP account. I have tried to do it anonymously, but I would be not allowed by the agency. So we have to use the WFP account. What we have noticed is that we had worse results with the WFP account, because it's like people see WFP. I mean, also WFP is well known in certain countries. For example, we have tried in Colombia, and we had worse results for certain indicators, in particular the indicator related to people that were angry, they went to bed, the auto hunger score went to bed angry, etc. And we felt that it was due to the fact that it's because WFP is well known, and they know that maybe, people think somehow that this data will go somewhere and maybe they will bring aid to my area. So we felt that the anonymous results, because people do not know, there could be a potential bias. They could think it's the government, it's whatever, it's an investigation, but we had a little bit worse result with WFP. It depends on the context. We have tried in the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, for example, the survey had been shared in the social network of the civil defense. And because WFP is not well known in the Caribbean, because we are not an implementing actor, and because it was shared by the government, the civil defense, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, depending in the CARICOM communities, the results were quite good, because it's like coming from an official source for the government, because we have also collected the side qualitative data. People felt, of course, they felt this is bringing some help during COVID pandemic, but it was more like felt this is an official, government staff that will help understand the situation in the country. And the fact that there was the WFP logo didn't, because WFP is not well known in the Caribbean, didn't yield different results compared to the anonymous survey. So when we did the second and the third round, we felt confident in using social networks. So I think it's important, the context. In the context that you mentioned, South Sudan, we are aware of these biases, even in face-to-face surveys, when we go with our nice t-shirt, etc. And we know that there is a bias, because people know that these questions are linked with assistance. What we have tried to do in some of these surveys is that we try to investigate through qualitative assessment what other things, what are other indicators beyond the standard indicators that we could use to check, let's say, to confirm that the situation has worsened, for example, or that the things are going in one of the directions. And one thing that we have used a lot are specific coping strategies adapted to the context, because they would somehow confirm that there is, for example, a stress in the family. And so if we see that the food consumption score is lower, it will also confirm that these other counterbalance questions that are not so intuitively linked to food security indicators. Or we are now increasingly asking some questions about perception. For example, now we are asking a lot of questions in Central America about, with the sort of probing, no, with the intention to migrate. Because of the crisis, there has been an increase in migration, and we're asking people somehow with layers. No, would you wish to migrate? Are you planning to migrate? And are you actually, make preparation to migrate, for example? So when we stopped at the first question, is like, would you like to migrate? We have huge amount, half of the population wants to migrate. And then when it counts, when we spelled it out with other additional, this is not something I invented. This is Joe Paul's scheme. Gallup scheme. But when it is spelled out with that, let's say, proxy or probing questions, and then we understand that maybe people ideally would like to migrate, that the people that are concretely plan to migrate are maybe, from 40% we go down to 5%. So my suggestion is that to insert questions that are not necessarily related to food consumption, so it can be a strategy that people widely use. It can be, something that they would engage in if they were actually in a worse situation, and use that as to confirm whether the data have been inflated or not. This is something that can be done with a little bit of, and of course, it will not avoid that there is a bias, but it would give you a better insight if the data are going in a direction that makes sense. No? So this is something that we have been trying to do to improve a potential respondent bias based on who is providing the survey. But we have to be conscious that when there is a logo, there could be a potential inflation of numbers because people think that there is a statement attached to it.
Thanks, Rossella. I think maybe let's take a moment then. I think we can change gears a little bit, go back to a brief explanation of the next part, which is going to focus on the opportunities. So we'll go back to a brief presentation for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to some more questions around opportunities that have arisen.
I would like to share what has been our experience in using web surveys for understanding food security situation, in particular during the COVID. First of all, of course, is the speed. We could collect a huge amount of data in repeated rounds very quickly. Generally, we would have good enough data in a week, but we have generally extended the round of data collection up to a month to have a lower administrative level representativity. So, for example, we would have national level, the good survey national level in a week, but we would wait up to a month to have at least a one level representativity in terms of sampling over a month. But this is amount in any case quite quickly. Recently, we have, as I said, we are starting to go back to face-to-face data collection, and to collect 1,500 survey in a country, it takes almost a month. Face-to-face, of course, they are longer, they're richer, etc. But it's also, and I would like to go to another point, it's very costly. And the cost issue has to be kept in mind because, we can have data more regularly at a lower cost. There are also flexible tools. Of course, like any other, questionnaires, we use certain standardized variable, but they can be flexible. We can change them pretty quickly, and we can make experiments because of the reduced cost. So we can, for example, now we are piloting this module on the intention to migrate. This is not something we have used in the past, but we can introduce, change, explore, and compare with different, in different types of module. As I mentioned, these are generally, the costs are lower. And the data has been great for WFP. I want to share our experience because during the COVID, in many countries, we were the only one. We were able to provide large nationwide or administrative department level data in several countries. And this has given us an incredible, opportunity. First of all, to serve the people, and to provide data to several governments. In the Caribbean, this data have been used widely to create and target the response for support scheme after COVID in several countries, in the countries where, you know, with the migrant population, I mean, with the larger migrant population, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, this data is being used by us to advocate with the government so that they would include these migrants in the social protection scheme, because we had an overwhelming evidence saying, you know, the situation is deteriorating, these people are suffering. We had the data and we could compare the data with what was happening to their people. And this has happened in all the countries of the region. So you have a tool in your hand with which is, you know, I strongly believe in data. I mean, it's evidence-based decision. It's like, this is coming out. 60% of people say that they're losing their job. So many people are not able to cover their basic needs. And so many people are resorting to negative coping strategies. So the opportunities is to advocate for people with the solid evidence and in a shorter time. Indeed, this was proven by the fact that we have been requested by countries where we are not present, like Mexico, like Argentina, that I mentioned, to start around data collection. For example, in Mexico, we have been requested to conduct a web survey on the change in consumption pattern during the pandemic by the National Institute of Nutrition, because they thought, you know, they had an assumption that people were changing diets, and they were starting to think what would be the long-term effect of this changing diet. And indeed, the remote data collection showed that people during the pandemic tended towards less quality, higher sugar intake type of food, and this could lead to several nutrition and health problems in a country. And therefore, the National Institute of Nutrition started to have more data to take informed decisions on in which direction they have to invest. So I think the opportunities are there, in particular if we partner. We were able to partner with the government. And of course, you know, for us, as for many humanitarian agencies, there is the need to inform the donor and to advocate, you know, for funding with data, you know, with valid information. I mean, we are not just anecdotally saying the information is worsening, but we have some indicators, some qualitative data, some information that we can show, and we can say, look, you know, something that, for example, we have been able to demonstrate, because I've been working in this region for quite some time. There has always been a critic that the food consumption score was not very working in Latin America, because most people have a good caloric intake and they shows only the quality. During the pandemic, we showed that the food consumption score was actually working. I mean, it's actually sensible to an emergency, and we saw the increase of people in poor and borderline food consumption, both in phone, in web, and then now in face-to-face survey. So I think we have been able to help, I mean, advocate, the data help us advocate, present facts to governments, and, you know, listen better to people. I have just to confess that when I was reading some of the surveys that we have recently conducted on migration, and I go over the qualitative data on what people put in the free text, it's overwhelming. I mean, when people are free to write whatever they want, and they're asked, you know, about certain, you know, challenging situations that are faced. I mean, it's for us, it's really, you know, as I said, it's overwhelming. It makes you cry, because you lead to all these stories of these, let's say, anonymous people to you, and people that in front of the screen, I mean, they are alone, and so they tape. And they tell you why they would like to migrate, what has happened with the African in Central America, what means family separation. I mean, the comments go in all the directions. And I think this provides us with an opportunity to add that, I think we should not always present stats and figures, but we should also be able, we know when we present data, to give a human face and explain what is happening in the context, so that people can be, so the data can be a support to you know, to solve a problem if we understand it better. So for me, it has been an incredible opportunity, and I'm happy now to open the floor for discussion and to understand, according to you, what would be, you know, the opportunities and the use that we could have in remote data collection. And I'll hand over to you again, Chris.
Thanks, Rossella. Yeah, I think we want to move on to another group discussion around the opportunities that have arisen from the COVID-19 pandemic, and just how you might have overcome those or use those opportunities to your advantage, or things you've learned, lessons you've learned that worked to around especially destigmatizing remote data collection. So my colleague will again share their screen, and we'll take some notes and ask a few questions. So this first question I had, there's a couple, it's just what opportunities arose to destigmatize remote data collection? I think if you wanted to answer it a slightly different way, but similar, is what did you find most valuable or surprising about remote data collection that you would like to take to other colleagues around who do remote data collection?
I think the opportunities is that data collection and remote data collection is faster. You will have the data immediately you are collecting, you can analyze. So, and also in the long term, it's cheaper, because at the beginning you have to do the training, you have to it's an investment, but in the long term is cheaper, I would say. And that should be the opportunities. And you can do it faster, more interviews in a shorter time, but also, again, I haven't seen the answer to the question on the quality, on the statistical rigor of this data. I don't know what is the experience of the work, because that is one of the questions that I have, that now we are collecting so remotely, but we're talking about like a baseline and headline. We're talking about the rigor statistical when we want to do comparison, inferential statistics. So that's something that I have a question on that.
Yeah, thank you, Nestor. I know we were in a group yesterday and had a very similar discussion about what does the statistical rigor mean when you have potentially a lot more data, but maybe you don't know, you can't be as certain about the quality. I will hand, Lloyd has raised his hand.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on what Nestor said there, where he talks about in the long term, it's likely more cost effective, but opportunities to destigmatize it in the short run, those costs are higher. And in many instances, people unfamiliar with data collection don't recognize that to do remote data collection, there's a lot of upfront costs in terms of material preparation, training preparation. And so I think the pandemic actually had a silver lining of really providing this push for organizations to start getting those processes and resources in place, but it's still going to take time for that to become more established. And once it does, I think that will go a long ways to just destigmatizing remote data collection, at least for shorter surveys and monitoring style data. But we're still in that, oh, we're doing it phase, and not so much, oh, it's done and we can do this phase. So I still think it takes a lot of just practice and experience and case studies and good best practices, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a really good point.
Chris, sorry, I would like to, I'm sorry because I lost for 1 minute, for a few seconds the connection, but I think I captured it all. I would like to address, if you think I have a couple of minutes, the statistical rigor questions, if it's interesting for all, and I could share, if I can share my screen, I could share a couple of slides, if you think this is okay.
Sure, I know that question came up yesterday in a different session, and I know that some of the people that were in that session are in this one today, so I think that's did this slide, would you be able to just talk through it and we can just take notes?
Okay. Yeah, I can walk through it. I want to share, because I was mentioning the case of, I have a slide here and I'm happy to share with the participants later. Well, I wanted to share the example we have in Argentina, because this is something, we are working with the Ministry of Social Development, and they are highly, still technical statisticians. This is not us, like sometimes humanitarians, we try to what is good enough. But when you work with the National Statistical Institute or with the ministry, they have a lot of questions about the statistical rigor. So what we did with Argentina was that we look at the census data. I mean, it's the data that they collected. A survey called the Index in 2020, and I mean, it was published in 2020. I think probably data was collected, before. But we started to look, as I said, comparing indicators. So the first thing we looked, for example, is that we would look at what would be the ideal sample size with using, statistical rigor parameters. And then we would compare what we have and what would be the ideal. And then we look also at data that had been collected in the national surveys versus our survey. For example, we look at how many men are in the population with the census and how many women are in the population. And in a random surveys, how many men we are capturing and how many women we are capturing. So is the survey, the random surveys representing adequately the population in terms of sex disaggregation. And for example, in the population of Argentina, just to give you an example, in the census, 48% are men and 52% are women. In the survey, we have a slightly different. We have 55 more men than women answered, 55% of men and 44% of women. But we conducted, tests to see how this difference is so relevant. Then we look at the distribution of urban and rural, and we had almost an identical distribution. So based on self-reporting in the census, there is a 91% of urban population in Argentina and 9% of rural. And in the survey, we had 90% versus 10%. So almost identical urban-rural distribution. Then we compare the population distribution in the survey and in the census, and it was almost an identical distribution. We looked at education distribution, and of course, as we are only interviewing the adult population, we are not looking at children, because we are only interviewing people that are over 18. We look at if the people that we are capturing represent the entire spectrum. People with a lower education, of course, we are not capturing people that are uneducated, but in Argentina, education level is quite high. So we look at this pattern. So we try to look at, as I said, an existing census and see how it describes the population, and then how the remote data is describing the population. And if they are similar, or if they are very close or almost identical, we can say that we have captured the population that is adequately representing the country. And then we looked at the food security, etc., and the outcome. But we try to compare with existing data. And the only thing that is also left to address is that we look at for web survey, we look at the internet coverage. And there are countries where the internet coverage is almost universal. This was the case, for example, of Argentina. And there are countries where, of course, the internet coverage lies Honduras. Honduras is one of the lowest internet coverage in the region. I think it's 42%, if I recall correctly. So in those countries, of course, it's like when you select a sample and you are already from the start excluding half of the population, and you know that you're only capturing one side. So you have to statistically, adjust your bias, because you know that there is a part of the population that is excluded. But otherwise, the inherent bias of both phone and web survey is that the universe is people that have a phone, or the universe is the people that have an internet coverage. So you can only adjust for this bias if you, before conducting the surveys, you look at the stats and understand what is the coverage. But I think that now we are building a lot of evidence as to demonstrate that the statistical rigor can be quite high, and we can be quite confident that we yield good results with this data.
Thanks, Rossella. That was a good example. Dalmar, you've raised your hand if you you have a comment?
Yeah, I think generally my comment is we have an excellent opportunity for remote data collection, and again, I think as Lloyd said, and this importance has only increased because of COVID. I think what I always ask people is, and we have debated this remote data collection, in different forums, is we're dependent on information for our work as humanitarian agencies. And in situations where we're not able to do face-to-face data collection, would you rather have some information on that? So, and I think the context is going to be very different. In contexts where we cannot do face-to-face, for example, I think good enough information from remote collection is important rather than having nothing, because the weakest link is going to be the lack of information. And imagine, for example, in situations like Yemen or South Sudan or Somalia, again, I go back to those ones because those are some of the weakest links that we have. If there's a conflict and we're not able to access the populations, maybe only do it through a phone here and there, then any information we get is important. The only other thing that I've always found myself when I'm dealing with food security indicators is they're all driven. And I think this is the thing that really concerns me a lot, is it's all driven by quantitative information. So I would rather have qualitative information also involved in this. And this is where the weakest link is in terms of remote data collection. It's the same thing for also face-to-face, unfortunately. But again, I am, as a person, very concerned with total dependence on quantitative data collection. We need also to have tools to get to improve our tools on qualitative data collection. Over.
Thank you, Dalmar.
I agree with you, Darmar, and that's what I think. I think we are pioneering, there are lots of nice projects, and I've seen that also some NGOs are conducting on listening to refugees' voices, and, and we can use remote data collection to help people, share the info. Something else that we have been trying to implement, again, remotely, is communication tools, chatbots, with people of interest. And of course, the fact is that the chatbots are more, while the web survey you send it to the population at large, to the entire country. Generally, the issue is that with chatbots, they are sent to a specific group, or even if it's publicized and you say, there is this line if you want to ask something about assistance for COVID. And we have had a lot of requests during the pandemic to develop chatbots for the government in the region. We worked with Honduras, with Peru, with Colombia, and for social protection program. And this is something very interesting. I think we have a lot of data there we still need to analyze, but because the chatbot works in a way where you can provide info. I don't know, people ask, would I be eligible for this particular bono that the government is putting out? So people ask questions, and there is an automated part of the chatbot where people can receive answers. But there is also the possibility to collect info. So we can ask people, so what is your particular difficulties? What is your problem? How do you see the situation evolving? And we have a lot of answers from people, and these are qualitative answers, are just people typing in. And this is something that we are increasingly more and more willing to include in our analysis, because I'm also a strong, as you said, I'm also a strong believer, as I mentioned before, that we cannot limit ourselves to quantitative indicators, because we need to provide context. We need to explain what happened. We need to say the why, and we need to say that what the people are experiencing. And sometimes, the food consumption score alone cannot tell us enough, or even if I say people are losing jobs, yeah, but what are they doing? What are the strategies implementing? How people are surviving? And this a lot comes from qualitative data, and that is why we are prioritizing inserting even in the remote data collection qualitative fields where people can write, a comment. And for me, it is working better than in the face-to-face. In the face-to-face, we get a lot of additional data, the context, the body language, we look at the house, and etc. But this is you collecting. And the people sometimes, they sometimes are very chatty, they tell you something, but sometimes they have a certain, recelo, we say in Spanish, they don't want to tell too much about the situation. But when they are alone in front of the screen, they tell you the story of their life in the space they have. And you have a lot of nice insight, useful insight for us to understand what people are doing, coping strategies, why they're leaving, why the migrants are still going out, why people are not going back to Venezuela, for example, what people did after the hurricane in Central America, on top of the COVID pandemic, etc., etc. So a lot of info, useful info came from the qualitative data.
Thank you for that answer, Rossella. So I wrote again in the chat, but I'd like to hear if there's any other, we have quite a few people who haven't spoken, and if you feel comfortable, we would love to hear from you. But are there any other opportunities that have been risen or maybe have been validated about remote data collection? Lloyd commented that it could be done. And I think it is a first step. I think sounded like there was some hesitancy about remote data collection in general prior to the pandemic, and just that people went out there, invested in some of the technology, and went out and successfully did parts of the quantitative, at the very least, surveys. I think that's a really good point. Thanks, Lloyd.
Just a question on the sampling design is easier. I understand when you do remote data collection, because basically you are going to do simple random sampling rather than the other more complex sampling design when you do in person. I'm asking.
Yeah, it's simpler. I mean, we do simple random sampling, of course, again, taking into account the biases, but we do it in random random, in particular for, I don't know if Mercedes, you would like to explain the Riwi methodologies for collecting data. I mean, as it is totally random, we to calculate the sample, we use simple random sampling. Depending on what we are trying to explore, if it's food security, migration intention, we look at different parameters to calculate the minimum sample that we would like to get. And we have put quota at sub-levels, administrative level, using the IPC parameters in order to establish what could be the minimum amount of data that we need to collect at, for example, admin 1 level. But for web surveys, phone surveys, we look at the bias, we look at the coverage, and then it's a simple random survey. For phone survey, someone is putting in the comments, you can do simple random. If you have phone numbers of the population of interest, for phone numbers, we do random digit dial mostly. We have access to we have two methodology, or we ask the companies in the countries to, or we have, through the government, a large database of phone numbers for the social protection system, for example, or most likely we use random digit dialing. So it's, so potentially we can call anybody in the country with the random digit dialing, because we have the set of numbers that are created for their particular country.
So Karen Fox had a comment, and she apologized for if it's already been covered, but having networks and strong skilled staff on the ground is key to addressing bias, safe and secure participant access. Karen, I don't know if you want to have any more comments about that. We haven't specifically addressed skilled staff on the ground and how that might help to address bias. So I'd love if you could come on and talk about that a little more.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Chris. And again, apologies. I don't know, since I jumped in late, I didn't want to kind of jump into conversations that may have already taken place. But, when we were doing some of our earlier work on qualitative in particular, but data collection in general, both qual and quant, using remote technologies, what we learned very early on, and this was from both emergency and non-emergency programs, is the real value of having established networks, connections, and relationships on the ground. And even when it's remote data collection and you may be using a phone bank, the extent to which program staff had the ability to set up the data collection event was critical, particularly for some of our more vulnerable populations, to ensure they had access to a safe, secure, not only technology, but also space and place in which to participate in a survey or some sort of qualitative inquiry. Over.
Thanks, Karen. Sorry, the lights shut out, so I had to get up because they automatically shut off. So I appreciate that. I think we have maybe time for one more comment from Eddie, who has seen some practical challenges in Nigeria where phone numbers shared from telecom providers aren't active at this moment. And how do we overcome this? How do we overcome this obstacle? I'm not sure if he wants to speak to that anymore, or if anyone else has any comments about that.
Well, I think the issue with phone numbers is always that it's challenging to get a pool, you know, of numbers, and it requires a lot of prior work, even with phone companies in the countries, and in order to have access to, either data sets of data, I mean, of phone numbers that you already have, or as I said, use the random digit dialing as an opportunity to, let's say create number and calling people. I have to say that based on our stats in Latin America so far, out of 10 calls, 1 is successful. I mean, in terms of phones that either have been, disconnected, are not active, people are busy, whatever. So we understand that if we work with the pool of numbers, I mean, if we have a limited set of the phone numbers given by the government, given by, I don't know, partners, or if it's in case of monitoring, it's our beneficiaries, we have to have a tenfold the telephone numbers compared to the sample that we want to collect. So if you want to collect 200 for an interview, we need at least 2,000 numbers. So this is something, I mean, as a tip for you to consider, that this is more or less the successful rate that we are experiencing in general, and this can be overcome if in the country you are able to, I mean, and it's different because if it's monitoring, it's only the people that are interested by programs, so you have a limited universe. If it's food security assessment in the entire country, you have a much broader universe, and random digit dialing can work because you can call anybody, so you don't need to call only the people assisted. So that could be, this is a difference that we have to take into account, whether we are doing a monitoring, so it's only people assisted, or if we are doing assessment in general for the population at large.
Thanks, Rossella. So I think that brings us about to the end. We did have one more question, so I'll just posit it for everyone to think, and maybe if you want to write it in the chat as we wrap up, that would be great. So I just wanted to thank everybody for attending this collaborative session. We really appreciate all the comments and discussion and collaboration. It's really how we get a lot of things done, is by sharing and information and working to demystify and support each other in remote data collection and any future efforts. So thank you everyone again for coming. Thank you to my colleague Rossella for hosting this session and providing us all this great information and PowerPoints and all this knowledge. So we really appreciate that. So thank you everybody for coming, and look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks a lot for the opportunity.